Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
And honestly, one of the best things that this book has done in my heart is to be able to give Donna back her husband because he died he died in the 80s and she's been without him. But in this book, all of him is still there.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 35, made in 1983. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or of authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Andrea Loney about her book, Take a Picture of Me, James Van Der Zee. Andrea J. Loney received her MFA in dramatic writing from New York University. Since then, she has worked various jobs, from screenwriter to teacher of computer skills, and she even ran away to live with a circus. Today, Andrea spends most of her time writing the kinds of books that she would have enjoyed as a child, stories that celebrate the humanity of all children. She lives with her devoted partner and their embarrassingly spoiled pets in Los Angeles, California. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Read, Learn, Live. This is your host, John Monaster. I am here today with Andrea Loney, author of Take a Picture of Me, James Van Der Zee. Andrea, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hey. Thanks for coming on. I'm really excited to have you. The book was great. It was super fun to read and beautifully illustrated, and I'm really excited to talk with you about it today. I sort of like to start off with, just in the author's own words, a kind of summary of the book. What's it all about?
Well, Take a Picture of Me, James Van Der Zee is a book that pretty much encompasses, I would say, about 80 years or so of the life of Harlem portrait photographer James Van Der Zee. And this guy's deal is when he was about, I don't know, 14, 15 years old, he was the first photographer in his entire town of Lenox, Massachusetts. And then he moved to Harlem right when Harlem was getting, right around the time of the Harlem Renaissance. Mm-hmm. And he took pictures of everything and everybody, and he kept taking pictures as a portrait photographer of different families, particularly middle-class families, middle-class black families in Harlem, pretty much his entire life. And he had ups and downs with his career. He wasn't the best businessman, although he was a great artisan. And there were several points where it seemed like his whole career was going to be over because of technology, because of people moving from one part of New York to another because of age. And yet the man kept coming back over and over again, and had his last big hurrah as a photographer when he was about 96 years old. He got an honorary degree from Howard. And and he was taking pictures into his 90s, married his third wife when he was 93 and she was 33. He has a fascinating life. That part's not in the kid's book. But
yeah, I was like, I don't remember reading about that.
Technically,
probably a good idea.
It's hidden in there. The picture of her is in there. And if you look at it, you can kind of infer what happened.
Aha. Sneaky.
He snuck it.
Yeah, well, that's a great summary, and I agree. This guy led just an incredible life. So before we get into the book itself, I always like to talk a bit about the creative process that always
Mm-hmm.
fascinates me. So I'll just start with a real broad question. What's your writing process? What was it like for you every day as you started to put the book together?
Well, the thing about this book, as opposed to some of the other books that I've written, is that it took me a very, very long time to put this book together. I got the idea for the book about 11 years before I actually wrote it down,
Hmm.
or before I actually wrote it out as a draft, because I wasn't really sure what angle to take it at. So I am one of those people who tends to have to talk my way through things, much to the chagrin of people who don't want to hear so much. But I have really great hairdresser, and I would tell her all these stories. And at one point, I told my hairdresser the James Vanderzee story, and she like literally looked down at me. I mean, and she was like an actress and media professional, and everything,
Hmm.
on the side. And she was like, "Why are you telling me this, and why aren't you writing this?" And I'm like, "Well, I couldn't possibly. It's a historical thing, and I'm not a historian." But she's like, "No, just write it. Just write it." So that gave me the courage to actually write it down. So what I did, I had read a biography of his, um, written by James Haskell. It was called James Vanderzee, The Picture Taken Man, and it was a wonderful. Just you, James was so generous in how he just talked about his life and his feelings and all this other stuff. He was a great person. He was a great character, and of course, I had way more than I could ever fit in a picture book. So what I did is I wrote out the first two drafts of it. Was somewhere between an obituary and a Wikipedia entry. It was not for kids. It was so boring. And I went to the library and I read a stack of books that came up to my hip. It was so high, all these different books. And I just got all my facts and got all my figures. I made a timeline of all the events in his life, and I juxtaposed them with world events and United States events and photography events to see where he fit into the world of photography, where he fit into the evolution of the United States, since I think he was born the same year the Statue of Liberty was built or something, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And just to kind of, because it's one thing to write about a person, but a person exists in a context of a world around them. So I wanted to kind of show that world and then show him. And I basically spent a month slugging it out, thanks to unemployment, by the way. I didn't have a job during that month or so, so I was able to just delve in and spend all my time at the library with these books that you had to wear gloves in order to touch, and you couldn't
Wow.
take them out. Yeah, oh, I felt so special. I'm like, I'm a professional researcher with my little books here. Um, but yeah, I worked really hard on it, and I wrote draft after draft until I got a version that felt like what I wanted, because he wasn't an obituary Wikipedia kind of person. He had the soul of an artist. And I wanted to write something that felt that way, that gave you that light, loving feeling when you read about him. So I worked on it. I showed it to critique partners and people who I knew how to write picture book biographies, and sent it off to Lee and Low, crossed my fingers, hoped that the work was worth it. And then I heard back from them that that it won the Lee and Low New Voices Award and they were going to publish it. And then my whole life was different.
It's a great end to that story too. That's great. I really enjoyed hearing about sort of the process. It sounds like you had a very clear idea of how to go about that. And you've written other books. Had you written another
Yes.
book similar to that, or how did you have such a clear focus? Okay, I'm going to go. I'm
Well,
going to put him in this context. I'm going to do a timeline. How did you set yourself up like
I
that?
I've been I think, let me think, how did this work out? The James Vanderzee book, I want to say, was the it might have been the 14th, 15th, or 17th picture book that I'd written.
Hmm.
I've written lots of picture books. A lot of them are animal stories or stories based on my childhood, different kinds of things. I have another book out called Bunny Bear. And Bunny Bear ended up being published, I think, like 6 months before the James Vanderzee book came out. And that book is about a bear who believes that he's bunny at heart, and how that all works out for him. But in any case, it was really just about writing, just trying different things and seeing what worked out. Reading, I generally try to read about 20 picture books a week. Before I really started it, I read about 100 different picture books, and I read them in different categories. I read, I don't even know how many biographies I read, because when I was a kid, a picture book biography is like, here's a boring dead person. here's some more facts about this boring dead person. Wake up. Here's the dead person again. And you're just like, oh my gosh, I don't ever want to be dead and have somebody write about me like this. And they were
Mm.
never children. They were always old, that kind of thing. And I volunteer with second graders reading picture books to them once a month. We read a picture book and then we do arts and crafts. And we came across some really amazing biographies that you're just like in it. And they would start with the person, whether it was Galileo or Einstein or Jacques Cousteau. It would start with the person as a child who was just like the kids that were around us, and you can kind of see how their life choices and their life history led to the thing that this person became famous for. And I was so impressed by that. I was so impressed by how many different ways there were to tell this adult story to a kid, because there's the thing that we all can relate to. Because I was trained as a screenwriter and because I worked as a screenwriter throughout my 20s and into my 30s, it's all about, okay, I have this idea and I have to outline it.
Mm.
And once I'm clear on what the outline and what the arc and the structure is, then I can start seeing, okay, how is this character working with this arc and the structure? And the whole point of working on a true story is you have this mountain of information of a real person's life, and then you have to sculpt out which part of it is the actual story that you're going to tell here. Because all of us contain like the Alexandria library worth of stories in our own lives, right? There's a million stories that we could tell and a million different points of view we could tell on the same story, but what story was I telling? So that I had to like kind of craft that.
Hmm. And while you're doing that, I'm wondering the extent to which you were kind of consulting or coordinating with the illustrator, because this book is
Mhm.
illustrated and it's just absolutely beautiful. I mean, I feel like each page was almost like a painting, the way that it was done. It was just really gorgeous. And
Yeah.
so, how did that collaboration work? At what point did you start talking with the illustrator?
Okay. So this is the coolest thing about writing picture books, like traditionally published picture books. You, the author, never meet the illustrator.
Oh,
I
wow, I
mean,
didn't know that.
maybe you do like way somewhere down the road, like after the book has been out for a while. But what happens is you write these words, and in my case, I wrote illustration notes. I wrote a lot of illustration notes because I wanted it to sound a certain way, but I wanted it to look a slightly different way so that there would be tension between the words and the images, which again is like a screenwriting thing.
Hmm.
So I wrote out my text and said, and these are the images I want to show. And then they went to the editor, and the regular editor said, okay, or the art editor said, this is how we're going to make this look. They contacted the illustrator. Keith Mallett is a fine arts illustrator whose work I have loved like forever, my entire life. He does artwork he does paintings, regular paintings that are usually seen in like if you go to like, I don't know, like black churches or black cultural events and everything, these are the big pictures that are going to end up on somebody's wall,
Mm.
and that kind of thing. So I was really, really like so delighted that they chose him, because it almost felt like they were choosing family. They chose the artist who has the artwork on my grandma's wall, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so what they do is they give him the notes, and then he does the sketches, and then the sketches come back, and then we look at the sketches and we talk about them, and then we make adjustments, and then they go back, and then he does the paintings, and the paintings come back, and then we look at them and make whatever more adjustments we need to make. But it's all through the editors. It never goes directly the writer to the artist, which is important, because that would probably artists are very emotional and temperamental people sometimes,
Mm.
writers and illustrators, so it's probably best to have that intermediary so that everybody's working towards the book. It was a weird process though, because I had done so much research for so many years. I mean, I could tell you exactly what his hat looked like, exactly what the hem of his pants looked like, because I had looked at all these thousands of James Van Der Zee pictures. And James Van Der Zee would talk about like his clothing and like how they chose what they chose and all this stuff. So I'm thinking in my head, oh, this is all the illustrators read like 11 years worth of stuff like I have, but he hadn't. So the first set of illustrations just did not look the way I wanted them to look. He
Ah.
made reasonable assumptions. He made reasonable assumptions that I never articulated because I just assumed he had the information that I had. For example, James Van Der Zee grew up very middle class in a resort town. Everybody was always pretty dressed up all the time. That's just how they. His parents were like the maid and butler to Ulysses Grant. Like
Right, I saw. Yeah.
yeah, these were like fairly fancy people. And so when I envision him dressed in these nice clothes doing things because that was always his aesthetic. And then when the illustrator made the first set of illustrations, there's this kid with no shoes and like a hoop and it looked like, I don't know, something from like the Little Rascals or something, which is perfectly reasonable to assume, but that wasn't him at all.
Hmm.
So for things like that, we had to go back and make changes and say, like, no, this didn't happen here, it happened there. This is what they would have worn. He grew up in a multicultural town where like black people and white people went to church and school and worked together. So when they showed him in the classroom, the illustrator initially drew him with like all black classmates. I'm like, he was like one of the only two black kids in a class ever, his
Hmm.
entire schooling, as was I, which is another reason why I love, reading about his history. So we had to go back, and what they did is they kind of changed the coloration, but the features are still the same. So if you see that page, that's what happened there.
Okay. No, that is really interesting. I had previously interviewed two girls that had written sort of a picture book for adults,
Uh-huh.
and they're best friends, and one of them did the writing and one of them did the illustrations. So, and they worked super closely together. So I guess
Mhm.
somehow they were able to pull that off. But that's a really good point about kind of two separate creative minds might not always be able to agree on everything. And it's important to have
Yeah.
someone to kind of help push things forward. Hmm.
Yeah, the thing that's amazing about it though is, and I had this situation with my Bunny Bear book as well, and with other things that I've written, is even though it's like, how could this person see what I have in my head? But they somehow do. I mean, once we made like tiny little adjustments to the James Van Der Zee thing, pretty much everything he drew in there looked exactly what I imagined. And one of the best parts, the very first image of the little boy drawing looks exactly like my nephew.
Oh, wow.
Exactly. And I don't know how he knew that or what, but it's like my whole family just like, look, it's Z-Man. It's him right there. So it's been such a wonderful experience.
Yeah. So to go from that, I always like to ask, what was something difficult about the process? Like, were there any kind of roadblocks you ran into that were unexpected, or was there anything that was particularly hard about putting the book together?
Well, the very hardest thing about putting the book together was gathering the courage to do it.
Hmm.
I knew I wanted to do it. I knew I wanted to write it, but I could not figure out for the life of me how to get like second graders interested in the story of this 80-year-old guy and his photo exhibit. Like I just I couldn't see an inroad to it. And then even when I figured it out, I was so terrified that people were going to read it and be like, "Oh, you didn't know enough about this history of blah blah blah. You're not a historian. You're not this." Like I kept thinking that I didn't have enough information or expertise or something to really pull it off. And then, like I said, finally I was like, I'm just going to do it and we'll just see how it works out. Another thing that seemed like a roadblock, but turned out to be like one of those like Super Mario boom boost kind of things
Yeah.
was his widow is still alive. Donna
Hmm.
Van Der Zee is still alive, and she is very devoted to preserving the legacy of her husband. So at one point, after the book was sold, after the book was written, we had to talk with her, and she had notes for every single page of the book. This wasn't right, and this had to change, and this, and all that other stuff. And again, she was there, we were not. The things that were written down in all these different books and articles didn't always jive with her memory of it. We needed her for certain pictures, all this stuff. And I felt like I was defending my dissertation when I was
Hmm.
talking to her. And at one point, we're both crying. And well, because I'm so passionate about his story, and she's passionate. She married him, I mean, so it really came down to this thing where we were both so upset how he had been slighted his entire life. And we really wanted to bring his story to the world in a way that the world could appreciate him really once and for all. Um, and then she became like my biggest ally in this whole thing. So I was terrified at first of all of that, but it turned out to be the best thing ever.
Wow. That's such a huge turnaround. I'm glad that happened because
Yeah.
yeah, that must have been very uncomfortable at the beginning to like just have spent all this time and effort to write, this epic book about, after reading all these biographies and picture books and everything, and to get just everything kind of redlined, like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Although that is the whole creative process. Like
Yeah.
you write this thing and you love it so much, and someone says, I love it and I'm gonna buy it. And they look at it and they're like, okay, I
Yeah.
shredded it. Now put it back together in this way. And you're like, I thought you loved it. And that's what it means to be collaborative.
Hmm.
I mean, you're not just by yourself writing things just for yourself, you're sharing with other people. And honestly, one of the best things that this book has done in my heart is to be able to give Donna back her husband,
Mm.
because he died in the 80s and she's been without him. But in this book, all of him is still there. I mean, not all of him, obviously, but a lot, like his heart is still there. And every
Yeah.
time I talk to her, we get to talk about how awesome he was, how funny he was, and all of that. And that's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, it's helping his memory stay alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is amazing. Well, I'm sure she really appreciates then the fact that you took this time to write the book.
Hmm.
So we've danced around it enough. Let's get into the book itself because there's lots
Okay.
of interesting stuff to talk about. Um, so, and I think you talked a little bit about this story of James Van Der Zee, but maybe let's go back to kind of the beginning. You briefly mentioned where he grew up, but what was his childhood actually like, and how did that childhood sort of influence his life going forward?
Well, one thing I want to say, and I might have said this before, I was so incredibly blessed in researching this guy that he gave so many interviews. He gave lots of interviews. There's several books on him where
Hmm.
I literally, he's just talking about, this is why I like to eat this particular type of food, and I like this kind of, just
No stone
all these
unturned. Yeah.
no stuff. And he had like this amazing memory where he could, like, he was in his 80s and his 90s, and he's talking about stuff that happened in like, you know, 1905 and things like that. So I had a lot of great information to work with. Basically, how his family was established in their community. Obviously, his parents were well thought of because they had been the maid and butler of Ulysses Grant after he was out of office in New York. His family ran businesses in Lenox, Massachusetts, so people came to them for the bakery and all this stuff, and they worked in the church and everything. So they were he grew up in a town that loved and respected him,
Hmm.
possibly for the family that he was in and all of that. So that was one thing, that environment, and in a fairly fluid racial sort of a situation, because again, it wasn't so much about black and white there. It's when the aristocrats came, everybody was taking care of the aristocrats, black or white. Everybody took care of them. um, his family was very loving, big. His parents seemed to get along really well. He was always close to his oldest, I guess his oldest two siblings, because the rest of his siblings died fairly early in life. They didn't really make it too far into their 20s.
Hmm.
But everything in his family was about beauty and arts and being connected to nature and being kind. And um, and it's really funny when I look at the trajectory of his life. His first wife was not very supportive of him or his art. There was so much tragedy in their relationship and everything, and he really kind of struggled to have the kind of career he wanted to have back then. But his second wife adored him. I mean, this woman adored him so much. She was German and Spanish, so she was white. She passed for black. She pretended she was a light skinned black woman so that when they married, people wouldn't say anything.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, this man. But anyway, she was so devoted to helping him with his career and everything flourished and blossomed for him. And then again, with his third wife, we wouldn't even know as much as we know about him. He wouldn't have gotten as many accolades as he got as if it wasn't for his third wife clawing back all of his artwork and making sure that he got paid for things, and then bringing in people like Basquiat and all of that to have the pictures taken. So it seems to me that having this basis and being
Mm.
loved and cherished, surrounded by beauty, and encouraged to express whatever emotion there is through the arts, through playing piano, through the violin, through painting, through literature, whatever. It seems like that lasted him his entire life, and it helped him weather all of the horrible things that happened to him throughout his life. Because of course, nobody makes it to 96 or so without, struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. So after the book starts, kind of talks about his young childhood, it covers kind of what happened in the segregated South and how,
Hmm.
he ended up moving to New York. And so you start to really encounter this big theme in the book, which is the idea of segregation, the ideas of
Hmm.
racism, which is touched on. And I thought that was really interesting to have in a children's book, a young children's book, because it of course is raising many issues that probably parents might be a little uncomfortable with, or it's stuff that maybe they haven't really thought through and encountered at this level in their lives before. Later on, James gets hired as an assistant photographer. It's his big break. He's really excited, and then the main guy is just like, no, you're going to be in the back. We can't have you out here in front of clients. No one wants their picture taken by a black man. So there's a lot of explicit, raising of these themes, these intense themes. So, you did this on purpose, obviously. So I'm curious to know about what sort of conversations you thought this would create for the kids. Where you thought kids would start with this, and what you hoped they would understand from that, and kind of would they be able to make a comparison between things then and things now, and how that's similar or different.
Well, it's funny because I don't know that I thought about how the kids would respond to that part.
Hmm.
I never thought about it so clearly until I actually went out in the world and started reading this book and seeing what the response was, which was fascinating. It was
Yeah.
not what I expected. It was way better in many cases. But to back up, part of the reason why I put that in there, and I think I explained this a little bit, is that I grew up in a town there were very few black families. Most of my education up until I got to college, I was one of only one or two black people in a class. Usually I was the only one. And I could really relate to some of those aspects of James's life, so that when he went to Harlem, that was the first time he ever saw so many black people in one place at one time. It just shocked him. He was
Hmm.
just completely like, gaga over the whole thing. And he was into Scott Joplin music with the ragtime. I mean, it was this amazing thing for him. And for me, that's what it's like when I moved to New York and I went to NYU and I like met all these people and I'm like, hey, this is really great.
Yeah.
So I could relate personally to that. And as far as the experiences of overt racism, there are children who go through that right now. I
Hmm.
know children right now, places who are going through things just like that. So when I first started going out with the book to my local libraries here in Los Angeles, they would set me up for story times with like toddlers. And I'd
Hmm.
be trying to read the James Vanderzee book. I'm like, he was an elevator operator. I'm like, I'm just babbling to you because that makes no sense when
Right.
you're like five, right? And they didn't necessarily get what was going on with all of that. So mostly what I do when I read it to young children is I just like we just pretend to keep taking pictures and say, and he kept taking pictures, and we just focus on that part because
Hmm.
a lot of them don't at a young age they don't get it. What I found when I started reading to third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, sixth graders, as soon as we get to that page where they tell him to go to the back, they all do the same thing. They go, racism. And it's so funny. They
Mm.
all have the same. This has happened in Texas. This has happened in, where is it? Texas, New Jersey, um, California, Harlem, every place I go, all these different kids. Now it's usually kids of color. But still, even, even like some of the white kids are like, ooh, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. And that's a wonderful opportunity for me. And I'm like, yeah, sometimes there's racism in the world, right? Let's just deal with this. So, what do you think he did? What
Mm.
would you do? How would you handle this? And then we read through all the things that he did, and then I stop again and I say, okay, so he had racism. What did he do to deal with it? And then I have them answer, he tried to do better than his boss. He made people feel comfortable. But it's a wonderful teachable moment to say, and even if racism isn't your specific problem, if your problem might have been like sexism or any other kind of ism, um, you don't have to just be like, oh, it's a problem, I'll just give up. There's a way to get around it. There's a way to deal with it. So that part I think is really, I love that part, and I love it because that's the part where like the kids like really like kind of engage with it and have to think of how they would handle it. I've also found that when I read it to the toddlers and we have like the stack of books at the end, like, okay, I'm done reading. The parents like run. There's like, I'm not ready to talk to my 2-year-old about this kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, and which again, I didn't experience the same thing when my book came out, and that came out first. So I'm glad that I had that first experience, like, oh, bunnies, whatever, we love it, whatever, as opposed to, wow, you're asking me to deal with this thing that I'm not used to talking to my kids about. But it's interesting because I think that for children of color, there's a lot more proximity to those sort of topics than
Right.
for kids where it's not something that comes up all the time, that your parents don't have to warn you when you go into a mall in a new town to behave a certain way, or people may behave a certain way towards you. You
Mm.
know, it's a whole thing. So I'm glad that it was in there, and I love showing how he dealt with it. It didn't stop him. He was undaunted. He made something even more beautiful out of his life because of it.
Yeah, that's a great takeaway. That's wonderful. One of the things you mentioned was one of his sort of methods of dealing with that is that he tried to do better than his boss. He
Hmm.
tried to be the best possible photographer.
Yeah,
And one of the things that it seemed like he was able to do was really make people at ease. And his
yeah.
boss was like really intense and just kind of hurried and didn't really do that very well. And James seemed very kind and patient and got people to relax and kind of show
Hmm.
off their best side of themselves. And that
Uh-huh.
made for a much better photo. So I was just wondering, how did he develop those skills? Was that something that that's just his nature growing up? Did he have to think about it? Did you learn anything about that?
It appears to me, from what I've read about his childhood, that he was very easygoing and he was very sweet. Um, and his mother used to say that he needed to be careful because some woman was going to realize all he had going on for him and was going to trap him.
Hmm.
And he didn't listen, and that kind of happened, I think. And one big thing that happened for him that is not in the book, and I specifically chose not to put this in the book, is that around the time that right before he moved to Harlem, he had been working in a hotel. He left school, and he was working at a hotel as a waiter. He was a musician, and he was going to set up a whole photography studio right there in Lenox so that he could take pictures of all these different people. He had this whole big plan. And then at the restaurant, someone dropped a stack of platters and blamed it on him. A white man blamed it
Hmm.
on him, and it got real racial. And he punched the guy in the nose.
Whoa.
And again, he's like what, 17, 18 years old. These things can kind of happen.
Yeah.
Testosterone. But it ruined his reputation there. And all of a sudden he couldn't work there anymore. And he had this whole big dream that he was planning, but in that one moment of losing his temper, he lost that specific dream. And I think that kind of stuck with him, that kind of stuck with him. The idea of like, I could jump, to conclusions, or I could act, or I could sit back and say, how am I going to deal with this? So
Hmm.
that's part of it. The other part is taking pictures. Taking the amount of pictures that he took meant that he had to come up with some kind of a way to do it. And it is an old photographer's trick to, when someone comes to the photo studio, hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in so long. I've never met you before. I haven't seen you. How are you doing? How are the kids? Come on, let's just sit down. Oh, don't I love the way your hair looks like? This kind of like he used to greet people like hello friend kind of a thing,
Hmm.
where people would automatically feel at ease so that he could get their natural smiles and their natural joy to come through. So
Yeah.
some of it was a trade technique, but I think a lot of it was just his personality. Like he was just like in love with the whole world and everybody in it. And if he saw something that he wasn't in love with, he'd take a picture of it and make it look better. That's really what he did.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. So, speaking of taking pictures, I mean, one of the things I thought was most interesting is that you pointed out that a lot of photographs of black people at that time were very sad and grim, and they were portrayed a very specific way.
Mhm.
And James, really made an effort to take photos of middle class black people that,
Mhm.
kind of just made them look great, showed them living their lives. Like it wasn't just this sad, grim thing.
Mhm.
And to me, that's sort of a perception influencing reality issue. And I find that very interesting from sort of maybe a psychology perspective. So, yeah, maybe talk a little bit about why that shift was so important about how people's perceptions can influence reality from seeing photos.
Well, I think a lot of his choices to do those sort of things again came from his upbringing,
Hmm.
came from where and how he was raised, came from how he saw himself and his family. So when he goes out, and actually in between Lenox and Harlem, he spent some time in Virginia, and he did go and he took pictures of schools there with his first wife and everything, and he saw some stuff that really upset him. He saw people looking really sad and downtrodden, and he just didn't want to be a part of promoting that.
Hmm.
Again, he saw something that he felt was unlovely and he made it lovely. And that's how he dealt with everything. Or if he saw something that was lovely and he made it lovelier. So people would probably even show up to his studio and maybe not have as much finery, and he'd like kind of give them some props and a little bit of clothing and kind of, you know, it kind of always makes me think about like the people who, there's people in the world that when they look at you, they see like the beauty of your heart, and they tell you that, and you walk away and you feel all good after you spent time with them. Not only did he do that, he made a photo record of what he saw.
Hmm.
Now, sometimes people would look at these photos and say, this is a great photo. It doesn't look like me, but it's a
Yeah.
great photo. It's like, I made it look even better. Um, and I think that there's a whole idea that you have to see it to be it. So I think that if African Americans are not in control of their own media, let's say, our own media, and we're constantly being shown these pictures of sad, grim, poor, destitute people, it's very easy to incorporate that. But what he was doing was something completely different. He was just saying loveliness, beauty, joy, pride, all of that. And he was putting that out there so that when people saw those pictures, stand up a little straighter, feel a little better. This could be me. This could be my future, as opposed to this only white people look like that, only white people dress like that.
Hmm.
There's a lot of lies and propaganda that were being spread around before, I would say, the before the Harlem Renaissance, because it's the whole idea, like basically before the Harlem Renaissance there were white people living in Harlem,
Hmm.
and kind of black people showed up and there was white flight. And usually before some kind of a flight thing, there's like, oh, these people are coming, that's going to be like, this is going to be so terrible and all that other stuff. Well, his pictures kind of belied those thoughts. you know
Ah.
you know
Yeah.
this is what came. Culture came, beauty came, the arts came, all of that. I think it's really important for all people to be able to define our own images and to say who we are, and that's what he did. And he didn't do it in like in a militant way or in a loud way, or and he did it in this lovely beautiful kind of, and then here's this image, and then here's this other
Yeah.
image, and here's a calendar of images, and.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and to kind of piggyback on that, you mentioned that it's important for people to be able to define their
Hmm.
own beauty, to define things for themselves.
Hmm.
One of the things that the book talked about was how James kind of slowly became irrelevant because
Yeah.
more people started to own their own cameras. And so they could just
Right.
control, they could just take a photo whenever they wanted to.
Yeah.
And of course, now we're completely saturated. Everyone has a camera with them all the time.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about it, and he sort of got rescued, as described in the book, by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They came
Yeah.
along, they did a huge exhibit of his work and became
Hmm.
a big hit. And, he kind of became famous again and well known. And so I thought that was very interesting. Maybe talk a bit about what that was like for James, and then just more generally what things are like now that we kind of have our own control with cameras versus, relying on a photographer, and what that means for photography.
Well, as far as James kind of his work kind of falling out of favor, the interesting thing about his work from the beginning of his career to the end of his career, he always had like an Edwardian Victorian aesthetic.
Hmm.
Kind of like he never left the downtown Abbey type of
Yeah.
artwork or type of decor and style and clothing and all that other stuff. And I remember like one of the interviews he gave in the 70s or something like 60s, and he was like, balking at afros and things like that. Like, so basically the culture around him and the area around him had moved on from his aesthetic.
Hmm.
His kind of stuff was quaint. His kind of stuff is like when you go to an amusement park and you take an old timey photo after a while. He didn't
Yeah.
change what he was doing. The world just kind of moved on without him. And for him personally, it didn't fit into his personal aesthetic, what was going on. And it wasn't until the world looped back, or parts of the world looped back to him and said, yeah, let's have a nostalgic moment and take a picture in this beautiful style, that it meant something. And I guess it always is like that, where fashion and beauty and art and culture, there's like this 20-year lag or so, where like the people who grew up with something like, oh, I'm so over that, and then their kids or their grandkids come along like, oh, this is so cool, let's do this
Yeah.
thing, it's
Yeah.
so wacky. And that's really what he just lived long enough to like be there for the
To go through
revivals,
all the
you know.
cycles.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah, to go through the cycles. I mean, as far as photographs and beauty and all that other stuff now, again, I honestly feel like as long as there has been somebody to sell somebody something to make them look different,
Hmm.
there has been some kind of artificial beauty fashion aesthetic. You
Yeah.
know, it's always been there. As far back as you can go, you're going to find somebody saying you should look like this, and therefore, if you don't look like that, here's a product to make you look like that. So there's that. And I do think that the fact that we have, like, I notice that when I go online to communicate with people, there's a lot of people who don't really want to see themselves as people anymore. They got like the cat ears,
Yeah.
the Snapchat kind of stuff, or they're an anime thing. And it's kind of weird how, almost in a way, culturally, I think people are kind of transcending what would be like a regular normal photo
Yeah.
and to like this idealized version of themselves, which may or may not be an actual human person. It's a icon,
Right.
something like that.
Right. Post-human.
So
Yeah.
yeah, post-human. And I'm not sure where that's going to lead. I'm kind of fascinated by it. But again, it makes me think about the fact James took regular pictures of people, but then he superimposed his own vision of that person on top of the original photo. And the end result was a combination of what really was and what he saw in his heart at the same time. So technically, that's kind of the same thing as the cat ears. Just, just like in our post-human version of it,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. And maybe the last kind of question I'll ask is, you have this afterword, which I thought was great, by the way. So there's the actual book itself, but then you have an afterword that is a bit more like an article that talks about him and gives more
Yeah.
information for someone that wants to read. And one of the things that you talked about in the afterword was these kind of hard times we've been alluding to. And he really, like you said, I mean, he lived long enough to go through a lot of bad stuff. He
Yeah.
lost his home, he lost his wife, he
He
lost the
lost.
rights to his photos apparently at one
Yeah.
point. I mean,
Yeah.
that's crazy. And so
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know, based on your research of him, how did that affect him? Because losing everything is just it's just devastating. And I'm just curious to know how that affected James and, how that affects people generally.
Well, I think from the very beginning, from his childhood, because he had another sibling who died, I want to say somewhere between when he was 6 and when he was 10.
Hmm.
Like there's a picture with the family picture and that kid's not in it because the kid had just died. That's
Hmm.
the one in the book. And I wonder if getting into photography was part of a way of him wanting to hold on to the people he loved in his life because there were no pictures of that kid.
Ah,
He just
yeah.
disappeared. And James doesn't really remember him that well. And he's so, in love with and close to his siblings, but that sibling he couldn't be that way with because, he disappeared so quickly. So, and then both of his children died. His son died when he was about 1. His daughter died when she was about 14. And he dealt with his daughter's funeral he did funeral pictures. That was a whole other side business that he had that I couldn't share with children, but he did funeral photography. And what
Hmm.
he would do is he would take a picture of somebody in their casket, and then he would like put all these Bible quotes and angels and lights and images of them from when they were alive and just make this beautiful tribute to them. So it appears to me how he always dealt with tragedy or heartbreak in his life is he went deeper into his art.
Hmm.
He just took more pictures and he pulled all the beauty in the world out of every face he could take a picture of. And that seemed to sustain him. And also, he says in his interviews, he just doesn't dwell on the bad stuff. I mean, for some things, it was really hard. When his wife, Gaynella, died, they were married for 50 years. Again, they absolutely ridiculously adored each other. Um, and when they lost their home, she lost her mind. She just had like a depression that she never recovered from, and then she got sick and she died. He didn't go to her funeral, and he was a funeral
Hmm.
photographer, but he never went to her funeral. Like that was just too sad for him. But still, he's working on people's pictures. He's got like a bunch of friends coming over and hanging out. He's still playing the violin and the piano and all that other stuff. So he just kept kind of everything came back to art and beauty for him. And that seemed pretty consistent throughout his entire life from what I've seen.
Huh.
So just go deeper into the art.
Yeah. That's an interesting coping mechanism. So yeah, I guess just to wrap it up a little bit, we talked about his whole life arc. I think at this point,
Mm-hmm.
was there anything else that you hoped people would get out of the book, or any other lessons you thought children or adults or anyone should think through while they're reading the book?
It's funny because there's things about this book that I love for kids, but there's
Hmm.
also things that I love about this book for grown-ups. And I'm honestly thinking I need to find a way to like read this book at retirement centers or something like that.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
for the older kids, let's say, for the senior grown-up kids, it's the whole idea that it's never too late for a comeback. I mean,
Yeah.
the fact that this man had an entire career that ended when he was somewhere in his 60s almost, and then it came back when he was in his 80s, and then it kind of fell apart again. And then not only did it come back in his 90s, but he got like a 33-year-old wife
Yeah.
out of the whole thing in his 90s. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't have to be over, and okay, he needed a little help and he had an assistant and all that other stuff, but he was able to keep coming back, and that's so inspirational to me. That's one. The one for the kids is the whole idea that if you do what you do with love and joy, you can overcome so many things if you find a way to love what you're doing and be joyful about it, because that's what he did. And every time he got faced with an obstacle in the story, it was his love and joy of photography, of making people look great, of giving people a memory that they could take with them, that sustained him throughout everything. And I think that that's a great lesson for
Yeah.
kids, because obviously if you hate what you're doing while you're doing it, it's going to take way longer to do.
Yeah.
But if you find a way to love it, then time flies by. The love is inherent in the work that you've done. You're spreading more love in the world. It's a win-win-win. It's an awesome thing.
Yeah. That's great. So yeah, what else? You've written lots of books. What else is going on? Are you writing anything else right now? What other projects do you have you're
Yeah,
excited about?
I'm always working on at least like 5 picture books at a time. They're always in different stages. I have some that are making the rounds right now. They're on submission. I have
Mhm.
another one I just put on submission. In 2019, my next book comes out. It's called The Double Bass Blues,
Mhm.
and it's published by Random House Knopf. And it's about a young black boy who is from the city who plays the double bass in an orchestra in a school orchestra in the suburbs, and how he has to carry this double bass, this gigantic instrument, like through the suburbs into the city, crosstown buses, all this stuff in order to get to a big surprise at the end, and how he kind of like takes in all the sounds and the beauty around him during that process and how it all works out at the end.
Huh.
So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm
Yeah.
excited. Wow, 2019 though. I like that you have so much in the pipeline and you're thinking into the future like that.
Yeah,
That's
that's how it is with picture books. It's like, I have this
yeah.
great idea. You're going to hear about it in like 6 years. And,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
just go on to the next
Takes a
thing.
bit.
And yeah, you just kind of keep it rolling. It's like, I always think it's like working on picture books is like being pregnant with a baby elephant.
Uh,
Like just years are going to go by before you see
takes a
like
while. Yeah,
anything.
yeah,
And
yeah.
again, when it comes out, it's like it's perfect and it's got all this stuff that it wouldn't have had if you did it in like 2 weeks. So,
Mhm.
and if I really wanted like immediate gratification, I would just do stand up comedy or something. You know what I mean? So
Right, right. It's
there's all,
different.
yeah.
All right, well good. That's exciting. So, yeah, let's wrap up with just some thunder round. I always like to ask some fun questions and then we'll call it a day.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yes.
Okay. So, first off, what is your favorite food and or drink?
Okay. So my favorite food is chicken and vegetables in almost any configuration. I
Right.
just like chicken and vegetables together, and it makes me happy. I have the palate of a 5-year-old. I don't need anything fancy. I also love apple pie. That's cool. And my favorite drink, I don't drink alcohol. I haven't had any alcohol since when? I love being able to do this. I think this year is my 18th year without alcohol.
Wow.
So, yeah, which has made it really fun going out places like, hey, you want something? Like, no, no, I really don't.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
going to give that up for something really good, and we haven't gotten there yet. Um, so my favorite drink is Arnold Palmer's, which is half iced tea and half lemonade.
Yeah, yeah. Those are
And
delicious.
oh, I know, it's just I love it. So, and if I have to pretend that I'm actually drinking with other people, I have tonic water and lime.
Ooh,
And
they'll
yeah,
never
which I
know. They'll never
yeah, they
know.
don't know. It's like a gin and tonic. I can feel like I'm an adult for a moment, and.
Sounds good. Where's your favorite place you've ever been?
This one was really hard to answer because I love
Ooh.
so many places. It was a toss up
Okay.
between Paris, because I just loved Paris. I loved how people were being creative everywhere, and you could just wander around and hear things and see things, and it was great.
Mm-hmm.
And Cameroon and in West Africa,
Mm.
because I'll tell this story really briefly. I have
Okay.
been fascinated with Cameroon since I was a kid. I always loved their music. I love the culture there. I was just always fascinated by it. I got a chance to go there to work with a volunteer group. And when I landed, everybody kept thinking that I was somebody who they knew. They thought I was their cousin. They
Huh.
thought I was their little sister who they hadn't seen for a while. They were angry that I was telling them, no, I'm from California. No. And I went and basically, like, the food was great. The people were wonderful. It was just this, and the land was gorgeous. It was like this place that I needed to be my entire life, and I didn't know about it. And I was so
Mm.
grateful to be there. And then years later, I did one of those ancestry.com things. 33% of my DNA is from Cameroon.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow. That's
yeah.
crazy.
So
What a story.
it turns out I went home and I didn't even know it was home.
Yeah.
But they
So
all
maybe you were
knew.
related to all those people.
I probably was. I literally think I found like this one what is it, kingdom, basically a fondom they call it, where they
Uh-huh.
had traded slaves out for like little Hummel figurines and everything. And the queen of that fondom, who was younger than me, we looked like we could have been sisters.
Wow.
And I was like, I think this is where it all went down.
Yeah,
I
that's
think this is
incredible.
it. I mean, I flew back like Swiss Air and everything, and I had like chocolates, and like Hans was like, being nice to me. But yeah, it was really kind of fascinating, that whole experience. But
Wow.
it was just wonderful.
That sounds great. Two places that I've never been, so I'll have to check them out.
You have to go. You have
I
to go to
know.
Paris. It's
I
just
know.
oh,
I know. I've been to many other cities in Europe, not Paris. Okay, but finally, if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
oh, that one's a hard one too. Um, Basically, I have this fantasy that if I were a superhero, I would bring spontaneous joy to the world at like random intervals.
Mm,
So, like, all of a sudden, I would like wave my wand, and then like ripples of just like joy and well being would spread across the entire universe. And like people who were like at war would just look at each other and be like, ah, and like just entire crowds of people would like fall in love with each other even for that moment. And like everybody would have this deep, abiding sense of love, connection, and belonging. And because the world moves and doesn't stay the same, I'm not saying this would last forever, but just to have that as a touchstone for everybody in the world so that they could always go back to it if they really needed it, I would love for
right.
it to happen.
That sounds wonderful. What a power if you were a superhero. That's a great one.
Hmm.
Well, Andrea Loney, thank you so much for joining me and
Thank
talking
you,
about.
God.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks for talking about your great book, Take a Picture of Me, James Van Der Zee. Whether you're a kid or an adult, I highly recommend it. I think you'll get something out of it. And like I said, the illustrations, which obviously you can't see here, are gorgeous. And take a look
Mm,
at those. So, yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show.
thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.